Alright, in the last video, got everything torn apart. Time to build back up. I'm going to be starting with the frame. The frame is basically the foundation of the car. And much like a foundation, if you screw it up, everything you build on top of it is going to have problems. And there are a lot of different types of frames, different ways to build frames, different materials you can use. I'm not going to get into all that, otherwise this video would be 9 hours long. So we're going to go with the simple ladder type frame. It's called the ladder frame because you got two frame rails going down the side, a couple cross members going across. If you stood it on one end and leaned it up against your house, you could climb up it and get on the roof. Generally with car stuff, the names tend to be pretty straightforward. So, where do we start? Years ago, I was building a car from the ground up like this, and my brother asked me, he said, "How do you know where everything goes?" And I said, "It's easy. It goes where it goes." That kind of sounds like a dumb answer, but let me explain for a second. When you're building a puzzle, you start with the edge pieces. Why do you start with the edge pieces? Because you know where they go. Then you work your way towards the center. In other words, you start with what you know and you work towards what you don't. In this case, we're starting at the front. On these old hot rods, you almost always see the front frame horns sticking out. It's a very distinct look, and I dig it, so we're going to be copying it. From there, we'll know about where the front suspension attaches. We know where the engine needs to sit. We know the body sits behind that. We know where the rear sits relative to the body. So basically, just start at the front, work our way back. Like I said, it's all pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You just got to be checking all along the way to make sure you keep everything where you want it. To start with, I grabbed a cereal box, free cardstock, made myself a template of the original frame horns. Then I transferred that template to pressboard. I did this so I could make sure it's exactly the same on both sides. Once I was happy with the template, I clamped it to the tubing and made my cuts. Plasma cutter definitely makes life easier for this sort of thing. With everything cut out and looking pretty, just a little cleanup with the angle grinder, and it was time to weld. Making Model A frame rails out of 2x4 steel is not a new thing. I didn't invent it. Guys have been doing it for a long time. And there are generally two different ways to do it. One is the way I'm doing it here. I cut it out and then took a flat piece and welded it back in. The other way is to cut the section you need to remove and then bend the bottom part of the 2x4 up to meet, and then weld it back together. I chose to go a different route really for one reason. I wanted to make sure everything was ground smooth so it looked like one piece. And that wouldn't be a big deal if I had a way to get perfectly flat grinds. Now I knew I was going to be using an angle grinder to smooth these out. The problem with using an angle grinder to smooth out a butt weld is it's really easy to go a little bit too far into the metal around the weld, and you end up creating a thin spot where the frame's actually going to be a little bit weaker. Doing it this way instead, I can inset the piece I'm welding just a little bit, just a tiny bit. Then I can grind everything smooth and I can actually leave the corners slightly proud. This means I get the smooth appearance, but the area I worked on is actually thicker than the tubing around it. Since these pieces are going to be on the bottom, you won't really notice it anyway, and we're talking about a very, very small amount. You can actually see it where the frame horns wrap up and around, but like I said, it's so small, it's not really noticeable, and if anybody's looking close enough to see that, they're close enough to get a boot in the rear anyway. Getting this insert piece of metal to bend all the way around the way I want it to is actually pretty easy. All you have to do is add a little bit of heat. You could do it with a torch, or you could just weld a little bit, and then bend a little bit, and then weld a little bit more, and then bend a little bit more. Before you know it, you're all the way around and good to go. And here we have a shot with my fancy camera slider that I was so sure I was going to need, and totally glad I spent money on that. With everything tacked in place, it was time for welding and grinding, and then some more welding and some more grinding. One of the tricks to minimizing heat distortion is to weld in one small spot and then jump over somewhere else, so you're not putting too much heat into any one place on the frame. After you've done a couple spots, you go do something else, let it cool down, and come back. There's nothing really hard about this. The trick is just being patient. Especially when you get towards the end, you start to think like, well, I'm almost there. I could probably get away with just welding this up. And oftentimes that's when you end up really screwing yourself. And after all that work, this is what we get. Now on to the front suspension. This is where things can get a little bit tricky, and there is some math involved, but don't worry, it's not too bad. We'll get through it. Front crossmember, I can't really mess with this. This is part of the front suspension. It has to do with where everything mounts, and when you change those, you change the way the car rides and the way it handles, and there's a lot of engineering that goes into this. And the guys over at Scott's Hot Rods who designed this front end did all that work already. So I don't want to mess with this because I doubt I'm going to come up with anything on the fly that's better than what they did. What I do need to know is where this frame is going to sit relative to the ground. So the frame sits inside this little pocket here cut into the cross member, and I need to know how high up off the ground that will be once the wheels and tires and springs and everything are all together. With the original frame rails being straight and flat, all the suspension is under the frame and the car sits up above it. That leaves us with a ride height that's comparable to most pickup trucks these days. That's good if you're driving around on dirt roads, but it's not real great for performance on modern streets. To get that down, we need a kick in our frame. The question is how much? So again, we work off what we know to find what we don't know. I do know that the tire I want to run on the front is going to be about 25 inches tall, which means the center of the tire is going to be at 12.5 inches. So the center of my spindle snout will be at 12.5 inches. With that, I can tell where the frame sits relative to the ground when it's in the cross member. From there, I know I want the ride height of the frame to be about 4.5 inches off the ground, maybe a little bit higher. I know that's about how much clearance I need with this wheelbase to get in and out of my driveway without wrecking the underside of the car. Now we just need to figure out this connector piece, how long it needs to be to give us the amount of drop we want. You can do this by just mocking everything up, or the quick and easy way is a little bit of math. Think all the way back to high school, remember? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Look at that, you really did need it in real life. Looks like someone owes their geometry teacher an apology. With the front frame rails tacked to the cross member, I hauled everything outside and started taking some measurements to figure out where the engine was going to sit. I wanted the kick in the frame to be right at the back of the engine, and that's also where the body would start. I settled on a 45-degree slope for my kick. Remember, the right way to do a miter cut is with the angle half on each side. So in other words, one side gets a 22.5-degree cut, the other side gets a 22.5-degree cut. You put them together and you have a nice 45-degree angle. Since I couldn't really move these parts at this point, I made my first cuts with the angle grinder. But for cutting the rest of the stuff, I wheeled out the trusty rusty Harbor Freight bandsaw. Now this thing is amazing. I'm surprised it's still going. I've had it for probably 15 years. This is definitely one of my better buys from HFT. If you haven't used a bandsaw, they're fantastic. Especially ones like this that have automatic shutoff, because then you can go do other things like get a drink or feed your fishes. And when the cut's done, the machine shuts off and you got your pieces just there waiting for you. The bandsaw made easy work of cutting all my mitered pieces, and I got everything welded together and ground down. Now you might be wondering why I would grind these butt welded pieces after at the beginning of the video I mentioned why I don't like grinding down butt welds. We'll get to that later, stay with me. With both frame rails already tacked to the cross member, I couldn't lay them flat on my fixture table to weld them. Plan B was using just about every clamp I had in my garage, and clamping them to other straight stuff, and welding just a little bit at a time, hopping around, let stuff cool off in between welds, just like I did the frame horns. Again, patience is the key here. After all the welding and grinding was done, we went back outside, get a good look at everything, see if Max, our supervisor, approves. He's keeping an eye on everything from his catio. Continuing with our process of moving the front to back, it was time to mock the body up on the new half a frame that we have and try and figure out how long this whole thing needed to be. Oh, look at that. It's almost starting to look like a car. Now we just need to do the same thing in the back and figure out how to get this under there. And this is why you don't leave bare steel outside overnight. Not a big deal, wire brush will take it off pretty quick, but still kind of annoying. Setting up the rear end, there's only a couple things we need to worry about. One is making sure everything's square. We want to make sure the tires are in line with each other and everything's pointed the same direction. The other big thing is the pinion angle. I don't really feel like explaining all the ins and outs of pinion angles. There's a great video that someone else already did about it. I'll link it in the comments if you're interested. Now, I did need a rear cross member to go across, and I wanted to make sure it went up and over the drive shaft with plenty of clearance. So I grabbed some 1 3/4 round tubing, put it in my tubing bender, and made a little 180-degree hoop. I notched out a couple pieces of 2x4 and welded the hoop in. With that, we had a nice little rear cross member. From there, we can almost see the light at the end of the tunnel. The entire rear subframe is set up more or less where it's going to sit when the car is done. With 2 straight pieces of 2x4 acting like frame rails. We just needed a kick to connect the rear frame rails with the rest of the frame that we already have. It's basically the same process as the front part of the frame. And there we go. We're just about done. There are a few things to address still though. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned I don't like grinding welds where the metal butts up against each other because it's easy to go too thin. And then I turned around and ground all my welds on the sides of the frame. But one of the reasons is I knew I was going to be adding these little plates over the top. They just help reinforce the joint. Some people say they're not necessary. Some people say they are. What I know for sure is they don't take long to make. The little bit of extra weight they add doesn't really matter. And they do give a little extra peace of mind. The other thing I wanted to address was this rear cross member where the back part of the frame attaches. It's going to see a lot of force. Every time you go over a bump, it's going to push up, and that's going to try and leverage this whole back section, wanting to twist this rear cross member off from the frame rails. So we're going to go ahead and cut out and add some reinforcement plates there too. A couple cereal box templates, some cold rolled steel, and a plasma cutter. Make it all pretty easy. A few minutes on the belt grinder, cleaning up the edges, and we're ready to weld. With the plates clamped up, it's the same rules as any other welding I did on the frame. A couple small spots at a time, moving around, not too much heat in one place. Definitely don't want to warp anything now. With all that welding finished, it was just about done. Kinda, sorta, again. I'm not 100% that this is where the rear suspension needs to sit. What I need to do is get the body together, set it on the frame, and make sure that the rear wheels are going to be centered in the wheel arches. So what I did was just put two little welds right here, one on each side, and those will be strong enough to hold it for now. And once I have the body back together, and I'm sure I'm happy with the way everything's sitting, I'll go back and reinforce the subframe and the way it attaches to the rest of the frame. I'll get the coilovers in, and I'll fully weld everything solid. But for now at least, we're done, and we've got a complete frame. It's something we can build on.